constructed. The nature of the mind is simply to know what's arising. The nature of the mind is awareness. But somehow we don't recognize this simplicity, the empty, open nature of awareness itself. We find that we get distracted, we get seduced, we get caught up in a whole variety of ways through some very long established habit patterns or tendencies, habits of thought, habits of feeling that catch us again and again. And often these patterns or these habits are so familiar to us. They're so much a part of who we take ourselves to be that they remain invisible. It's as if we've become so identified with them that we really don't even see them. And it's for this reason that we need to bring a very focused and clear and attentive mindfulness.
Don't sink, don't sink, don't sink, don't sink.
To the working of our own minds, so that we really can begin to see the forces, the tendencies, the conditioned habits that are at play. This is not an easy task. Buddha gave an image of how difficult it is. He said that it would be easier to conquer 1,000 enemies in battle single-handedly, and to do that 1,000 different times, that would be easier than to train the mind, to awaken the mind. So if you're having some difficulties, it's not that it's a mistake or that you're doing anything wrong. This is a very profound and difficult task. What the Buddha saw, and what we can see for ourselves very clearly in our practice, is that the underlying causes of happiness and of suffering in our own lives and in the world are forces within the mind. You know, very often we look out or about in the world and we see the suffering that exists. Suffering of injustice, of exploitation, of violence. It's a long list. The underlying causes of this suffering are the forces of greed, are the forces of fear, are the forces of hatred. And the very essential discovery and recognition is that these habits, these forces of mind, are not only out there, they're within ourselves. One of the deepest and most strongly conditioned energies or patterns in the mind, and one which, together with ignorance, is at the very root of our endless cycling through samsara, is the tendency or the habit or the conditioning of desire. So we need to understand this very carefully, very exactly. The word desire in English has quite a few different meanings. So we need to define precisely which desire we're talking about. So one meaning of desire is that of greed. One meaning of desire is that of motivation. And we have a desire to do something. We're motivated to do something. That might be unwholesome. It might be very wholesome and skillful. So this meaning of desire is different than greed. There's also the desire which means or entails the satisfying of just basic human needs. You know, food and water and shelter. And so this again is not the force of greed. In talking about desire this evening, talking about that quality in the mind which is craving, which leads to clinging, which leads to grasping. In the often typical translation of Pali, it's kind of like Victorian English translation. One way they translated this Pali word, which is tanha, the fever of unsatisfied longing. That kind of sounds like a Victorian romance. But it actually touches something. Maybe we're all characters in this great novel. This is the kind of desire I'm talking about. That of greed, that of craving, of unsatisfied longing, of thirsting, that quality in the mind. The Buddha spoke of three kinds of desire, three kinds of craving. One we're quite familiar with, and that's the craving for sense pleasures. And that's the kind of desire that's very operative in the world. Second kind of desire he mentioned is the desire for rebirth, craving for rebirth. And often this is in the context of desire for rebirth in the heavenly realms. And the third kind of desire the Buddha talked about, third kind of craving, is desire for not being reborn. Sometimes when people hear these three kinds of desire, the first we can usually relate to quite easily, we understand it. But sometimes the second two seem a little philosophical or abstract, or, oh, I don't really have this strong craving for rebirth in the heaven realms. And I don't think much about being not reborn. But as is often the case, at least in my experience with the teachings of the Buddha, very often something which at first glance does not seem so applicable to my life, when we examine it a little more deeply, investigate it a little more deeply, it's actually pointing to something very profound. This desire for rebirth or not to be reborn, desire either way, reflects some very basic assumptions about our lives, about how we choose to live. It's pointing to something very deep in us. On the one hand, it points to a belief or an assumption or an idea of ongoing life. Do we have that worldview? That something, some aspect of ourselves lives forever? The Buddha called this the eternalist view. Or do we have the idea, are we living our lives with the assumption that at death it's all over? Buddha called that the annihilationist view. And all of us, in one way or another, whether it's articulated clearly or not, we're living our lives with one assumption or the other. Either we think it's going to go on, or we think it's going to end. And this belief, even if we're not clearly conscious of it, very much conditions the choices we make. What the Buddha pointed out is the big problem in both of these beliefs. We all have one or the other, and yet there's an inherent difficulty in both. Because all three of these kinds of desires, desire for sense pleasures, desire for rebirth in the heavenly realms, desire for no rebirth, all are constellated around the idea of someone being there. All are constellated around the idea of self. And whether we're conscious of it or not, to the degree that we're caught in these desires, we have these belief systems, we are operating out of illusion. We can begin to explore very pragmatically this force of desire in our lives when we look at our closest attachments. When we look at the attachments, the closest attachments in our lives, that's when we can see desire at work. For example, we can look at the attachment we have to our bodies. And most of us are pretty identified with our body. We don't like it when our body gets sick, as it's aging, as it gets older, in the face of death. Are we really free in that? Are we free of attachment? Or are we holding on in some way or other? We can see desire operate very clearly, and this is something we all know very well. We can see desire operate in our attachments to people, certain people in our lives. We can see desire operate in terms of certain things that we want. It's interesting to begin to notice carefully the range of intensity of desire, because there's a very broad spectrum. Sometimes we experience the desire of an overwhelming passion, an obsessive passion, which consumes our lives. People get caught up in this, and a lot of great literature is precisely about this kind of desire. And that's true. I mean, some very great books, have been written about this all-consuming passion that can take over and the often destructive consequences of it. Desire can be felt in the form of whatever particular addictive cravings we have. We all have some about something. We can see desire at work in recurring fantasies. We're just either sitting on retreat or in our lives, just the play of fantasies over and over again. That's an expression of desire. Or even in a very minor way, something that happens countless times during the day. We can see desire in just the passing thought of wanting something. Now, it's not big, it's not consuming. It's just a thought of wanting arises in the mind, and there's desire in that. On retreat, the field of desire narrows considerably. In the world outside, we have great scope for the fulfillment of all these things. Here, it's a little more limited, but it doesn't really stop the desire from arising. It just finds a little smaller domain. One of the places I've noticed it most embarrassingly when I've been on retreat is I can be doing walking meditation back and forth and very mindful and very connected and very clear. Then I notice the difference between that and how I walk when the lunch bell rings. You know, it's very subtle. It's just that little, you know, that anticipation, which is kind of pulling me along. What is that? It's the energy of wanting. You know, and it's interesting to see actually somatically how that energy of wanting manifests. It is precisely this. You know, it's just that energetic leaning forward. It's not restful. You know, it's pulling us out of balance. In this retreat environment, everything's very quiet. People are just sitting and walking. But the force of desire in the mind. Often we go through periods of tremendous sexual fantasies. You know, where all of a sudden, oh, I have a nice hour to sit here. Let's have a good time. And we go through bouts of this, you know, and the mind gets really pulled in. It gets very seduced by it. Or even just getting lost or enjoying our own internal dramas. It doesn't even have to be particularly exciting, but there's some desire which pulls us again and again and again into whatever dramas we happen to be reliving. Sometimes we see desire in this context in a very subtle form. It's just that attitude or that energy of wanting diversion. Now, that's a kind of desire too. You've probably noticed how amazingly difficult it is to walk past the bulletin board without looking at it. You know, it's just, oh, just in case a new notice is up. What's important in all this is not that these shouldn't be happening or shouldn't be arising. What's important is that we want to take the opportunity of the retreat to really look at deeply what exactly is happening in our minds. How is this force of desire, which runs the whole gamut, you know, from consuming to very minor, how is it working in our minds, in our lives? How is it obscuring the natural clarity, the natural openness? We want to discover this for ourselves. It's not a question of just believing what somebody says or reading it in, you know, the Buddhist texts. The whole point, purpose of the retreat is to take this time and to investigate very carefully. This is a powerful energy. It's at the root of samsara. Can we really look at it? Can we understand it? In meditation practice, desire also comes or slips in quite an obstructive way in the form of expectation. And it's very insidious because sometimes expectation comes disguised as right effort. You know, and so we think, oh yeah, I'm just making right effort here. But really, it's effort masquerading. Expectation masquerading as effort. That sense in the mind of wanting something to happen. This expectation can also take the form of comparing mind. You know, compare our practice in our minds with others, gets into competitive sitting. It's kind of like this race for enlightenment, or this race for whatever, some experience. I got caught by this in one retreat I did. It was the first retreat I sat with Sayadaw U Pandita, and it was very intense, and a lot of my friends were sitting, and there was this sort of pressure. Of course, it was self-imposed, of kind of getting to the finish line. And it was a tremendous obstacle, and I was making myself more and more tight and tense. I was always kind of comparing, okay, well, how am I doing relative to everybody else here? It was all just projections in my own mind. But I had a great teaching from the flowers that were growing right out in the frontier. So I was doing some walking meditation. This was in the spring. Very much caught up in this kind of expecting mind. It was really filled with desire, filled with wanting. And I noticed the flowers, and some of them had just begun to come out of the ground. They were just beginning to come out. And other flowers had grown a little taller, and the bud was formed. And some of the other flowers, the bud was formed and actually opened already. And I looked at those flowers and I realized, each one of these is going to blossom in its own time. Nobody's racing. None of them are racing the other, or there's just the natural development, the natural progression for each one. And that was such a good lesson for me at that time, just to relax. I simply had to do my practice. And after that, it was surrendering to the Dhamma. Just surrender, let it all happen, let it all unfold as it inevitably does. That was a very helpful lesson to see and understand. So sometimes desire, our practice is in the form of expectation, of wanting something to happen. Sometimes desire comes in the form of trying to hold on to some state, which either we have or we had. We had a great sitting, and we go into the next sitting with this desire for it to be back. Trying to recreate past experience is like dragging a corpse around. It's gone, it's over, it's finished, dead. Let it go. It's such a relief. We don't have to be recreating anything. We simply have to be settled back and open to what's presenting itself. So that's very simple. There's no pressure in that. There's no tension, there's no wanting. The desire of expectation always brings restlessness and discouragement. So we want to see this. This is one of the aspects of desire that we want to see very clearly for ourselves. Because when we're filled, when we're caught by expectation, in those moments we are no longer being mindful and no longer being attentive. We're no longer aware of simply what's there, so the mindfulness gets weaker. As the mindfulness gets weaker, the mind gets more agitated. It gets more restless. As we get more restless, we get more discouraged. And so it's just this spiral downward. Where does it all start? It started with that unnoticed desire of expectation. We need to see all this very clearly for ourselves. What happens is that we get seduced, we get entranced by various objects of desire, whether they're internal states, whether they're external states. And it's like we start walking in this enchanted forest, and we're in this dreamlike state where all we can think about, or our whole reality, is for the fulfillment of that wanting. Is all about whatever particular object it is. And we no longer see the very passing nature, the very impermanent nature, both of the wanting and of the object of wanting. A very, very easy example of this is in the well-experienced phenomenon of the Vipassana romance. You know, people come on retreat in silence, maybe barely know one another, and yet at some point or another, the mind has this tendency to just feel this attraction towards one of the other people here. And the level of projection that can go on is truly staggering. It's like our minds get I don't know a strong enough word. They get captured, imprisoned, something, you know, by the thought of this person. And kind of doing walking meditation, and the person happens to walk by, you know, kind of sneak a glance, and there's that kind of excitement and rush. And if you happen to be sitting next to them in the dining room, or purposely go into the dining room to sit next to them, I mean, this whole drama is created. It has consumed a lot of airtime in this hall in the last 20 years. So again, we just want to see it. Instead of, it's not that we want to judge it, or it's just so we understand this very powerful force of wanting. Not only does desire hinder concentration and obscure the natural clarity of mind, the natural openness of mind, but it also, in the end, does not fulfill its promise of happiness. Now, why is it that we keep getting caught by desires? Because it holds out this promise to us. You do this, you get this, you have this, and you'll be happy. And there's that little voice of Mara in our minds, which is very insistent. Well, we go after these different sense pleasures because of the pleasant feelings that come. But as you know, and will know with even greater clarity and depth, these pleasant feelings are very impermanent. So what happens? We're always going after another one, and another one, and another one, and another one. And this is how we've been living our lives. It's not just on retreat. We keep looking for happiness in the fulfillment of one kind of desire or another. It's endless. How many desires have we fulfilled in our lives? Countless. Of all kinds. You know, from the small little ones to quite big and dramatic ones. But there is no end, because the pleasant feelings that come from them are very impermanent. So we feel them and they're gone, and then it leaves us wanting more. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't enjoy things. That's not the implication of all this. It doesn't mean that we should never act on our desires. What it does mean is that we should see very clearly and with a very penetrating wisdom the impermanent transitory nature of it all. So we can really ask ourselves the question in our practice and in our lives, how much of our life do we want to invest in the fulfillment of these desires? And how big a part of our life do we want to spend in doing this? At one time, I was on retreat, and I was sitting, and I was just going through this run of thoughts, that I was really getting into. I was just enjoying. Now I can't even remember what they were about, but and at a certain point, I just gave myself a talking to. And I said, do you want to think, or do you want to be free? And it just kind of crystallized the choices, that I was making. It's not that thoughts stopped coming, but it weakened that sense of indulgence. Just let me go into this one for a little bit. When we see clearly what's happening, that really gives us the space of choice. If we don't see what's happening, then we're just acting out all the old habits of our conditioning. So desire for sense pleasures in all the ways, whether it's the physical sense pleasures, whether it's the expectation in practice, whether it's diversion, whether it's great passion, whether it's addictions, whatever it is, desire for sense pleasures, one kind or another. This is the first kind of craving. The second kind of craving the Buddha talked about was craving for rebirth, particularly heavenly rebirth. The Buddha talked a lot about the heaven realms, and he talked about it by way of delighting the mind and creating a sense of joy, creating a sense of happiness. And the descriptions are wonderful. When I first went to India and practiced with Munindraji, he would spend a lot of time talking about these Deva realms, and beings born with bodies of light and everything beautiful, and they're born around age 16 or 17, they appear spontaneously, they're just ready to enjoy things. The description of these pleasure groves and heavenly musicians, and it's like complete delight on every side. There are even heavenly meditation halls, where we, in our bodies of light, can sit and practice. And it's said that Maitreya, the coming Buddha, is now residing in one of these heaven realms, Tusita realm, actually teaching the Dharma. In all of the Buddhist traditions, there are these descriptions of these realms from people who have experienced them in one way or another. Now, as Westerners, I think we tend to have some skepticism about it all. And it reminds me of a comment that Munindra used to make as he would be going on and on about these heaven realms and seeing looks of, if not disbelief, questioning, among the Westerners. He would go on very enthusiastic and excited. You don't have to believe this. You don't have to believe it. It's true, but you don't have to believe it. And then he would proceed to go on. So on the one hand, sort of the talk or the thought or the reflection of the Deva realms really do create a brightness in the mind. And if we can open to the possibility, a real delight. On the other hand, This kind of desire also is a trap. And it's like the bee buzzing around in the jar thinking, oh, maybe I'll buzz on up to the top for a while, the top of the jar, see what's doing up there. You know, it can go to the top, it can go to the bottom, it's still caught in the jar.